It's Armistice Day, and it's a great treat for me to have in the studio Pat Owtram, who is a magnificent 99, who served with, as part of the Bletchley Park operation. You were in the Y station, Pat, intercepting the Enigma code. You were part of that team which broke the Enigma code, which effectively speeded up the end of the Second World War.
Well, I think we did, and I was very lucky because we lived right in the country in Lancashire, but it was my grandfather's house, and he had an Austrian cook, and she was a refugee from Vienna, and she didn't speak English when she arrived, so spending my evenings with Mrs. Getzel, I did acquire conversational German, as we'd call it now.
Right. So you were able to, because you had to be able to intercept the signals, you had to be familiar with German. You had to sign the Official Secrets Act?
Oh, certainly.
And were you aware, Pat, working with those women in Y Station, how significant it was, what you were doing?
I probably didn't fully recognise it because I was still a teenager. And I was delighted that I could contribute something at my age to the war. I think sort of during the war, I did realise more and more that we were not exactly important, but quite a useful part of the intelligence services.
She's being very modest here. I'm joined with Dr. Tessa Dunlop, who wrote that book, Bletchley Girls. How significant were people like Pat?
Oh, hugely. And, of course, there was a desperate shortage, wasn't there, Pat, of German speakers. I don't think one member of the British cabinet could speak German. So we were having to find alternative means. Any men who could speak German weren't necessarily in the country. So Pat was this vital resource. And I think even today you remember your German alphabet for writing down those Enigma encrypted codes, don't you?
Oh, I do, yes. And what they needed, of course, was conversational German, because you never knew what would come up.
You can do your Caesar, Bertha. How does it go?
What, the one that starts Anton, Bertha, Caesar, Dora, Emil, Fritz, Gustav, and so on.
And what at night you would live in houses with the other girls from Camp Y? Did you talk about your work, or did you talk about anything else but your work?
I think we, if there was anything to talk about, would talk to each other about it. Of course, we didn't say a word outside our stations. We didn't tell our families.
I was going to ask, did your parents know what you were doing?
They didn't. In fact, my father couldn't really, because he was overseas and then a prisoner of war. My mother was extremely discreet. She was an ARP warden at home. And they never asked, and I didn't tell them or anybody.
It transformed your life in many ways, but also Pat just has this extraordinary cachet of anecdotes. She's also written her own book, Code-Breaking Sisters. Her sister Jean also signed the Official Secrets Act. I think they must be the last two sisters alive who served in the Second World War who signed that act. But, for instance, do you remember in the preparations for the D-Day landings? Tell us about the time you met Churchill coming over the brow of the hill with Montgomery.
Yes, this was, as Tessa says, I think the spring before D-Day, and I was stationed down between Dover and Folkestone in a listening station on top of the cliffs called Abbott's Cliff. And I'd been on watch, as we called it, in the early hours of the morning, came out about 8 o'clock, and coming up this path to our very remote little station was a whole bunch of people. And to my astonishment, Monty and the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, in the front of these army officers. And you were supposed to salute those kind of people in the Wrens, which I was in, but only when wearing a hat. Well, if you'd been on watch all night in a listening place, you were certainly not wearing a hat. So I did the only thing possible and waved at them all and said, "Good morning, everybody." And they all waved back and said, "Good morning." And they went on to the edge of the cliff. I thought, what are they doing? And they looked across because you could see Cap Grine very closely.
Right. Do you think they were looking to see, ready for the invasion?
They wanted to be seen. Because it was a decoy. It was
That's right.
Because the invasion was going to be much further west.
Yeah.
Clever.
And it would be reported back that Churchill had been down at Dover.
How very clever. And you were part of the Great Deception. Now, of course, isn't your friend Pat in a rather remarkable book because of her connection with George VI?
Well, I tell you what, Pat, who's lived virtually 100 years, if you're an oral historian like me, not Pat, I'm just going to do a project on Elizabeth and Philip. Do you have an anecdote about the late Queen? And Pat went, you'll tell me this wonderful story. So after the war, Pat, how many universities did you attend, Pat?
Oh, I must have been to... Well, I went to St Andrews University. They gave me a research fellowship.
And then Oxford.
To Oxford.
And then...
to Harvard Graduate
School.
So
3 universities. So her pushy aunt wants her to be presented at court, which had gone a bit out of fashion.
As a debutante.
As a debutante.
Right.
And you felt you were perhaps a little bit too mature to be presented at court, but along you went, didn't you, biddable as you were with your sister, and you were one of the sort of last cohort of people who met the King, and you have quite distinct memories of that time, don't you?
Well, I do, because I wouldn't have gone, but if your name has been sent in and it's royalty, you absolutely have to go, and only to sort of curtsy to the King and Queen. The King was looking very pale, very tired.
And he had a lot of makeup on, didn't he?
He did. He had makeup and sat on a chair at one side. And but the Queen, of course, was in very good form. And after waiting some time and the band played music, we did our curtsy. You have to back out without turning your back on royalty. That's more difficult than you might think.
Yeah. And I found this quite interesting because, of course, at the time everyone was in denial about how ill the King was. Pat goes in and immediately spots, well, he's wearing makeup and he looks terrible. Yeah. So she cameo, if I may say, in Elizabeth.
I was just about to say, come on, here's the plug for the book.
Yes, I've given it to Pat. It's not for you, Andrew, sorry.
Elizabeth and Philip, which is a great book. And Pat, that book is next to that rather remarkable badge on your jacket here on the right, which is, I think, the highest military honour from the French government.
It is. It's the Légion d'honneur military, and very generous of the French government. I mean, I did a little bit towards helping the French, but...
More than a little bit, perhaps.
Well,
and here we have King George. These are her service medals from World War II. This is the real deal.
Yeah. Pat, you are what personifies Armistice Day. You are a magnificent lady. It's been a great honour to meet you. It's very humbling. And you're looking very good, may I say, for your very mature years. She's written her own book, actually. It's called, what's it called?
Code Breaking Sisters. Her and her sister Jean Owtram.
Written by Pat Owtram. And, of course, Tessa's written her own book, Code Breaking Sisters. And, of course, Elizabeth and Philip, timely, perfect timing.
We keep busy. She keeps working. Isn't it, Pat? You're always busy and engaged. That's the secret to a long life. Retain ambition. And look at this wonderful hair.
Oh, well, we're tough old things.
You were tough old things, and we're very glad you were tough old things, because it was tough old things like you that made sure we won the war. Well, that's it from Pat and lovely Tessa coming to see me.